Welcome to Thinkin, a podcast series by Kautilya School of Public Policy.
Welcome to the new episode of Thinkin, the podcast club of Kautilya School of Public Policy. Today we are going to talk about a sector whose individual we have talked about, and the policy has focused a lot about their individual, but sector has not been in news so much. It was in news during pandemic, but we didn't talk much about it as economic perspective. And the sector we are talking is the informal sector. And to talk about that sector today, we have Professor Amir Ullah Khan, who is an economist and who has contributed a lot to the development sector, that much that I don't have the introduction to give, and I got confused when I got to the Google and when I got to Wikipedia. Thank you, sir. Thank you to be here.
Thank you.
So how do you, sir, first define informal sector? So we have seen that it has been seen in congruence with development economics, and we perceive as a subset of development economics. How much merit do you find in this argument?
Yes, in fact, it is, if you see it in one way, it is the entire development sector. So the circumference of the informal economy and the development sector is almost completely coterminous. What's important to understand is that when we try and define the development sector, or when we try and define the informal sector, we are looking at a sector that essentially is invisible. It's omnipresent and invisible, and that's the conundrum, that's the irony, that it's all around you, it's everywhere. It is there in the services sector, it's there in a big time in manufacturing, and it's obviously the entire agriculture sector, but it still remains brushed under the carpet. And that's why it's so heartening to have a discussion on the informal sector, an entire course on studying informal sector, because essentially as a country, when we move from the phase that we are in to the next phase, the central theme will remain the informal sector.
So what you also mentioned right now, how we are mistreating the informal sector, and there are negative connotation. That's why it makes it more important to talk about this sector. How much do you agree with this negative connotation, and is it informal always illegal, or is it always shadow, and is it always bad? So what's this sector all about, and why this negative connotation attached to it?
Good point. Firstly, I wouldn't say that the informal sector is deliberately mistreated. The sad part, the tragedy is that we don't mistreat it. The irony or the tragedy is that we ignore it completely, and therein lies the problem. There are various reasons why we ignore the informal sector. The biggest one being that we don't understand it. It doesn't fit into the concept of an industrial sector that has boundaries, that has clear objectives, that has a formal set of skilled people. The informal sector is almost by definition ambiguous and vague. It is almost by definition a confluence of people coming in from various backgrounds and providing various goods and services. And it is something, parts of the informal sector are parts that have existed forever. And in the same vein, parts of it are those that change almost every day, depending on the changes that we see in society. So therefore, the issue is that the problem that we are facing right now is that on one hand, the informal sector is changing. On the other hand, there is a substratum that doesn't change at all. So if you see, the world's oldest professions, sex work, teaching, these are large parts of the informal sector. Entire tuition industry, for example, that is informal, and that doesn't change, that continues. Whereas picking up e-waste is a sector that changes by the day. So therefore, it is very important for us to understand the informal sector not through traditional lenses that are carefully circumscribed, but by a multidisciplinary approach that will involve a lot of people like you, youngsters like you who come from various disciplines, who come with sensibilities that extend across populations, who also come with an understanding of the demography and the diversity of the country. The informal sector is in that sense a mirror of India. It is so diverse in every form. It has a large, for example, one of the major things about the informal sector that it possibly is the sector which has an equal representation of women in it. There is no other sector like that. It has tremendous amounts of exploitation, but on the other hand, it has huge opportunities too. Yeah. But to come back to your question, the reason the informal sector doesn't find its place under the sun, under the policy sun, I think the biggest cause for that is the fact that it is outside the tax net. And that's why you will find that the discussion on taxation, the discussion on broadening the tax base, is verily a discussion on how to get the informal economy into the tax net. A failure to do so makes people believe that it is a black sector, informal sector. This tendency in the recent past of looking at sectors that are not in the tax net as illegal is what hurts the informal sector the most. It is as legal as any other sector. Yeah. It has people who pay as many indirect taxes as anybody else. Yeah. In fact, because of the harassment that the informal sector faces, or because of the policy ambiguity it faces, there is a lot of taxation that comes by way of harassment and bribes. And because the informal sector contributes nearly 2/3 of the economy and employs more than 2/3 of our workforce, 80% or 90% of the workforce depending on various estimates, ignoring that sector will continue to keep India as a sector that is, as a country that only looks at the top 10%, that 100 million. The 900 and odd million people in the workforce will always be ignored. And if we want to develop, if we want to go from being a lower middle income country to a higher middle income country, from being a just about developing country to a developed country, you cannot afford to ignore 80% of the workforce. You cannot afford to ignore 2/3 of contribution to the GDP. You cannot afford to ignore 60% of exports that come from the informal sector.
So, sir, this again poses a very, very interesting question and very, very curious questions also. A state which loves taxing, why is not taxing the informal sector? And is it something to do with the negative connotations which is attached to it, or it's something else? So why we are not taxing?
Yes, very interesting and very important. First reason, it is difficult to tax, and therefore very often the administrative cost of taxation might be higher than the returns from taxation. The second is it is difficult to identify the person to be taxed, and therefore that extra effort that it will require to go and target the taxpayer is something that we shy away from. But thirdly, and that is what is most important about it, is that we find that indirect taxes are far more convenient. See, indirect taxes are regressive. Yeah. Indirect taxes hurt the economy. Yeah. But because it is easy to tax at the point of sale, it's very easy to tax the person who's spending the money, that we continue to rely on indirect taxes. That's why this huge fanfare and popularity of the GST. Yeah. If we want to include the informal sector in the taxation sphere, we will have to go after people who are ambiguous, vague, don't have addresses, and therefore will involve a lot more time and effort that it requires to collect indirect taxes. But taxation and tax justice and tax morale will come from the fact that when people pay their tax, then they will start beginning to ask for their rights. The informal sector doesn't ask for its rights because it feels that it does not belong, because it's constantly being told that you are shadow, you are black, you don't exist. And that's our danger. I think in that caste system of the workforce, we tend to keep the informal economy where it is because it is untouchable, because it is removed, because it is invisible. The moment it becomes touchable, the moment it becomes visible, it will start demanding its rights.
But don't you think, sir, like the nature of informal economy itself, as we say, and you were also telling us in class, and as you told here also, the way it is being defined, like there is no contract, and it's very hard to identify.
Yeah.
So how to task them? Other than tasking them in an indirect manner, how can we directly task them? Because we don't know them. So at the first and the basic problem lies is their identification, and then to task and how much to task. So does academia poses any light on this aspect of?
Yeah, the answer there is pretty obvious. See, what happens is that one is the role of technology. As technology improves, as people become more and more connected to the digital world, they will have a social security number, they will have an ID. Why do the OECD, the rich countries, not have a large informal tax force? And that's largely because all of them have an ID, and an ID is all that it takes for you to contact them. It is not that everybody is taxed or is taxed heavily. Those who are earning little will not be taxed. The simple definition of taxation is tax the rich, and therefore those who aren't earning too much of money will never get taxed, either in the formal or the informal sector. So it's not about getting taxed, it's about being in that tax net, it's about being recognized, it's about being on that database. So what happens is that as more and more workers get access to the digital world, as they get more and more financially included, that is where you will find that problem gets sorted out by itself. The other thing is that one must understand that in the labor cost arbitrage market that we exist, it becomes self-serving to keep the workforce informal. The moment you keep workforces informal, and you are allowed to keep them informal, your labor costs come down. And that's the big reason why formal manufacturing sector, formal services sector prefers to keep a large part of its workforce informal. That cannot be encouraged. The moment that encouragement goes away, the moment the contract law changes and does not allow for easy contracts to be given out, that the economy will become formal. That's why the new labor code presents some dangerous portents, because it actually talks about further legitimizing contract work, further legitimizing informal work, fixed time contracts, and that is why it's a path that we are traveling into, which is a contentious path. It is not that we cannot have fixed time contracts. We do have fixed time contracts, but it should not be paving the way for further informalization.
So that's true, sir, and that's need to be tackled. But one of the criticism of this taxation is like our obsession to formalize informal economy. Like that is also one of the major criticisms. So do you think, do we really need to formalize the informal economy? And when we pose those argument of taxation, we are seeing informal economy as a monolith, but there are segments to it, and we can't see there are formally informal, informally formal. So how are we like differentiating between that when we are seeing it as a monolith?
Very, very critical question, that some of us want to remain informal. In fact, a lot of us want to remain informal, especially those in the innovative, creative fields want to stay informal. So therefore the question is not about formal and informal. The question is about vulnerable and protected. The problem with our informal economy is that a large part of it is vulnerable, is marginalized, is below minimum wages. People like me are also informal economy, and we want to remain informal because that allows us to do what we want to at a pace that we want to, but we are also protected. We are also secure. That amount of protection and security, if that goes to the marginalized sector, then this distinction between the formal and informal will disappear. In a lot of ways, what's happened post-COVID is that, it's a very interesting thing that we are seeing post-COVID. A lot of the formal sector is getting more and more informalized. See, when you work from home, you have become far less formal than you earlier were. And people are preferring that. Today, a lot of IT firms are finding it difficult to get people home to office. If you insist that you come to office, staff is actually quitting. So people actually want to be informal. We all want to be less formal. But the crucial point is the protection. You should not be vulnerable. You should not be exposed to various threats. The informal economy's problem right now, to a large extent, is the manner in which the informal economy stays at the very edge of poverty. That the moment there is a job loss, or moment the wages get cut, or the economy slows down, that entire section of population goes below poverty line. That's the danger. If we have social protection in place, and one of that is a universal basic income, then we won't have to worry about an informal economy, worry about the informalization of an informal economy. Then we'll have to worry about just ensuring how many of them get trained, get skilled, move to better jobs, have better price discovery, have better stakes in a market economy. That's what we'll have to worry about. Right now we are worrying about them because they have this large problem and a challenge of getting impoverished.
So on the same lines, a new concept of gig economy has emerged, and even the Niti Aayog has written a paper on it. So can we say that now the vulnerable section of informal economy is still being said as informal economy, but the formal sector who wants to be in informal. So we can't always correlate informal with poverty. So are we differentiating between gig economy, which is more good, who wants to be informal, or is there any correlation between gig economy and informal sector yet?
I am not as sanguine about the gig economy as you are, because one, it's new. We have still not seen the manner in which it proceeds. We still don't have any clear data on the trends in the gig economy. Is the gig worker a vulnerable worker? Is the gig worker being overburdened? Is the gig worker now far more entrapped into difficult labor situations? And certainly the gig worker has no protection by way of contract, maybe contracts in some areas, but not in every area, and it's certainly not organized. That other distinction is important of being organized and unorganized, and the gig worker is completely an unorganized worker. Organization does have its own challenges, but it has a certain amount of advantages. So early days to say, because the technology and the circumstances are changing so fast that the gig economy and its trajectory in the future is still unknown. The important thing to realize also is that the gig economy really burst forth because of an extraneous and a difficult and an unprecedented event like COVID. Will the gig economy continue to proceed in that direction, along that curve after COVID, after we recover? We don't know. So therefore, the gig economy's fault lines are still not out there in the open. It certainly is a very large employer. It certainly is an employer that is a little better than a completely informal non-contracted worker, but it has enormous windows open for exploitation.
But so one parallel if we draw with informal economy or gig economy also, which you are also pointing out, is the vulnerabilities which they have, and it's not across the sector. Like some of the people who is involved in informal sector is not vulnerable, and that is because of protection, but also the amount of income which they are generating. And that aspect of informal economy has been overlooked a lot. So we talk about a lot of protecting informal economy, but we never talk about how to develop informal economy and how to raise their income. So like why is that? Why are we not talking about we are not seeing them as a self-employment and raising their income generation, because that's the amount of work or that's the quality of work they could afford with the available knowledge or skill set we have. So what's stopping us doing that?
Yeah, this requires a lot of thought, and here is where our learning and our experience with startup cultures comes in very handy. So look at what happened with the taxi cabs. See, when all these ubiquitous apps came up, Ola, Uber, and a variety of them across the world, it was hitting at one of the biggest informal sectors, the taxi drivers. Now, did this Uberization of taxi cabs work for the benefit of the taxi drivers? It certainly did wonders to consumers, because you now had an app, so easy to hail a taxi. You didn't have to stand out there and wait for one, uncertainty and all of that. You knew how much it was going to charge you. Did the taxi driver get benefited? A moot question still. Early anecdotal experience suggested that some people made a lot of money, and some people maybe continue to make a lot of money. But has it worked in the favor of all taxi drivers as a community? I am not saying either way. It's too early to say. These hotel rooms, OYOs and whatever. Again, did the app work well? Yes, suddenly we have affordable, simple, neat, clean hotel rooms. Does it work well for everybody? Why is it that with one little accident like COVID, the entire taxi sector, the entire hotel sector just collapsed? So the vulnerability of those sectors is very high, and we cannot afford to have such high vulnerability anywhere. That's not just fair. So in that gig economy, while yes, there is anecdotal experience to show that some people did benefit, there is the same anecdotal experience that says that it is not able to handle any shock. So we'll have to find some way in a long run that is not threatened by such externalities, that the informal economy can work with some remarkable technology interventions. Technology certainly has helped.
But sir, that leaves me with a thought, like, why are we shying away by implementing the concept of free market in informal economy? If we see what happened by introduction of apps, some were benefited, but some get left out because of competition. That's how any market, any model works. So are we trying to suggest that we need to control informal economy, then only we could reduce the vulnerabilities? What's the reason we are shying away to implement the free market concept?
Very basic question. And the answer there is that look at the informal economy. The informal economy is the most market friendly economy that you can find, because the informal economy is not touched by any regulator. The whole issue with the informal economy is that it runs completely as a free market. The number of players is infinite, the number of producers is infinite, the price is dynamic, it moves completely on a supply-demand equilibrium all the time. Now, if that is the case, then why do we even need to touch it? The reason for touching the informal economy, which has existed for hundreds of years, existed more than any other economy, any other sector, is because now we are wondering whether there is market failure there or not. And we saw market failure there. We have seen occasions of market failure there, because what the market did was that while it kept this entire economy free, unregulated, it was unable to tackle the vicissitudes of supply and demand. So when there is a high demand for labor, then you find that the industry suffers. When there is a very high supply of labor, then you find that wages just crash. Migration, distress migration, all of that. So we see a large number of ways in which market fails because of the lack of ability to negotiate, because of the lack of information. A lot of the labor market fails because of the lack of information. Everybody is heading into one area while the demand is in another area. So therefore, that is where we found that the informal economy suffers from market failures. And it is to tackle those market failures that one finds we need some amount of intervention. It should not be the kind of intervention that will lead to some regulatory capture. In a lot of ways, this has to do with two of the most important sectors in India. Two sectors that were always unregulated in India and did phenomenally well for the country. It is those two sectors which, because of which India is known outside the world. What is India known for? If you ask people internationally, they will say Bollywood, films, informal sector. What's the other thing we are known for? IT. Again, for a long time an informal sector. Was Bollywood exploitative? Was Bollywood, Bollywood's informality, did it lead to a lot of innovation? You bet it did. That's why it became one of the most creative industries. IT sector, when it was totally unregulated, it became very creative, did so well. But did these sectors lead to some exploitation? Did they lead to some siphoning of money? Did they lead to some collapse of firms? See, what happened was that, in Bollywood, a lot of illegal money came in, unsavory elements came in, and therefore that sector started getting noticed. Similarly with IT, a Satyam collapsed, and you found that there was a gate that opened for regulation to move in. Is it always good? No. The IT sector, for example, keeps complaining. Stay away. We did well. The Bollywood sector says, institutionalize us, allow us access to finances. Till it is informal, it will not have access to banks. But don't come any closer. But once that gate opens up, now the government decides what dialogues you write and who you hire and what. So that's the problem with regulatory capture. That once you open it up, then it can threaten the whole genesis of the sector, which is its innovative capabilities. So it has to be that delicate and very sensitive regulation. In the informal sector, that's what we are asking for. That it's not, don't take that easy approach of just going in with a sledgehammer and regulating it like you would regulate a stock market or whatever. Take the stock market itself. When it was informal, it developed hugely, but then it also gave rise to big scams. So that's the danger. That we have to maintain that balance. Keep the informal sector relaxed, have no entry barriers, remove all exit barriers if they exist. Let price discovery happen on a daily basis, but let there not be exploitation.
So as you always say, sir, time is the biggest country, and that's what happening today also. But we would love that if you could do a part 2 and we could discuss more on migrants issues and how this free market could evolve. Thank you a lot. Thanks a lot, Professor,
Thank you
for having
Thank
being
you.
here. Thank you.